The Magic Mountain, Part 3. The Shadow of Respectability. Hans Castorp had been afraid he would oversleep, he had been so thoroughly exhausted. But he was up and about earlier than necessary, and had plenty of time leisurely to pursue his usual, highly civilized morning routine. Its chief utensils included a rubber basin, a wooden bowl of green, lavender-scented soap, and a straw-colored brush, and was not only able to tend to matters of personal hygiene, but also to unpack and put things away. And as he passed the silver-plated blade across the perfumed foam on his cheeks, he recalled his muddled dreams, and smiled an indulgent smile at such nonsense, shaking his head with the superiority of a man shaving by the light of reasonable day. He did not feel all that well rested, but fresh enough to meet the morning. He powdered his cheeks and slipped into his plaid undershorts and red Morocco leather slippers, and still drying his hands, he stepped out onto the balcony, which, although private, was connected to those adjoining and separated from them only by an opaque glass partition that extended almost to the railing. The morning was cool and cloudy. Long banks of fog lay motionless along the hills to both sides, while masses of clouds, white and gray, were draped on the more distant mountains. Patches and streaks of blue sky were visible here and there, and when a ray of sun broke through, the village in the valley below glistened white against the dark forests of pine on the slopes. Somewhere, morning music was playing. Presumably it came from the same hotel where the concert had been held the evening before. Muted chords of a chorale drifted toward him. A march followed after a brief pause. Hans Castorp loved music with all his heart, its effect being much like that of the porter he drank with his morning snack, profoundly calming, numbing, and doze-inducing, and he listened now with pleasure, his head tilted to one side, mouth open, eyes slightly bloodshot. He looked down at the winding road they had followed up to the sanatorium the evening before. Short-stemmed, star-like gentians were blooming in the moist grass of the slope. A section of the level ground had been fenced in to form a garden with gravel paths, flower beds, and an artificial grotto beneath a stately silver fir. Next to a metal-roofed arcade, open to the south and filled with lounge chairs, stood a flagpole painted reddish-brown and displaying a banner that fluttered full now and then. A fantasy flag, green and white, with a snake-entwined caduceus, the symbol of healing, at its center. A woman was walking in the garden, an older lady with a gloomy, even tragic look. Clad completely in black, with a black veil wound round her disheveled gray-black hair. She wandered restlessly along the paths, keeping an even but quick pace, her knees slightly bent, her arms hanging stiffly at an angle in front of her. Her brow was creased by a frown, and her lowered, coal-black eyes, the skin beneath them forming drooping bags, were directed straight ahead. Her aging face, with its pale Mediterranean complexion and large, careworn mouth turned down at one corner, reminded Hans Castorp of a picture he had once seen, of a famous tragedian. And it was eerie to watch how this pale woman dressed in black matched her long, somber strides, apparently without realizing it, to the rhythm of march music in the distance. Hans Castorp gazed down at her in thoughtful sympathy, and it seemed as if her sad appearance darkened the morning sun. Simultaneously, however, he perceived something else, something audible, coming from the adjoining room on his left, the room with the Russian couple, so Joachim had said. Noises that were likewise ill-suited to this cheerful, fresh morning, that tainted it, making it seem sultry somehow. Hans Castorp remembered that he had heard the same sounds the night before, but had been too tired to pay them any attention. Giggles, gasps, grapplings. There was no disguising the indelicate nature of the sound, although, in his kind-heartedness, the young man at first tried to give it a harmless interpretation. One could use other terms for his kind-heartedness, an insipid phrase like purity of soul, for instance, or a more serious and beautiful word like modesty, or disparaging words such as avoidance of the truth and hypocrisy, or even a phrase about the mystic piety of shyness. And Hans Castorp's reaction to the sounds from the adjoining room combined something of them all, and was visible now as a shadow of respectability that darkened his face, as if he should not and did not want to know anything about what he heard there. It was an expression of propriety, not exactly original, but one he was in the habit of assuming under certain circumstances. And with this look on his face, he returned to his room to avoid having to listen any longer to the proceedings, which, despite the giggles, sounded terribly serious, disconcertingly so. But the events on the far side of the wall were even more audible from his room. An apparent chase around the furniture, the crash of an upturned chair, a grab, an embrace, slaps and kisses, and then, of all things to accompany the invisible scene, a waltz was struck up in the distance, the tired melody of a popular ballad. Hans Castorp stood, towel in hand, and listened against his best intentions. And suddenly a blush rose up under his talcum, because what he had clearly seen coming had now arrived, and beyond any doubt, the game had turned bestial. Good God in heaven, he thought, turning away to finish dressing with as much noise as he could manage. Well, they're married for heaven's sake, that's as it should be at least. But in broad daylight, that is a bit much. And I'm almost certain that they disturbed the peace last night, too. After all, they are ill. That's why they're here, or one of them is at least, and a little self-control wouldn't be out of place. But of course, he realized angrily, the real scandal is that the walls are so thin, and that you can hear everything so clearly, and that's simply intolerable. Cheap construction, naturally, shamefully cheap. I wonder if I shall see these people later, or even be introduced to them? That would be most embarrassing. But now Hans Castorp realized to his amazement that the flush that had come to his freshly shaven cheeks had not subsided, or at least the warmth that had come with it was not about to depart. The same hot, dry face that had bothered him yesterday evening, and that had disappeared while he slept, was back now in full force. This did not make him feel any friendlier toward the married couple next door. Indeed, he pouted his lips and muttered something very disparaging about them. And now he made the mistake of splashing his face with water again to cool it, which only made matters worse. And so he was feeling cross and at loose ends when he heard his cousin knock on the wall and call out to him. His expression as Joachim entered the room was not that of a man refreshed by sleep and ready to greet the morning.